So the final thing that I'm actually going to do on this image, just to show you guys really quickly, because in the old days we would do this using tonal work. Mixer brush, in some ways, using a split frequency makes this seem much simpler. You can see that there's a lot of, I'm getting weird sort of like shadows in here. This whole area of her crotch just looks, it's really mottled and stuff in here. This is, this just doesn't look smooth to me at all. So again, I am going to go to my mixer brush, and let me see something here really quickly. Okay, I'm going to go to my mixer brush. I am going to do this all on my low layer, and again, I'm just going to start scrubbing in these areas where I feel like they need to be smoothed out. Now you can see that I've smoothed out this one line here in the back, but there's still something that remains. That tells me this has to be on the high layer, so I will go in and fix that on the high layer. But I'm going to continue to work around this whole area that's sort of like running down her stomach. I'm simply dragging back and forth across that, and this is just all going away. And I'm doing the same thing down on her lower belly down here. I'm just trying to make those lines a little less obvious. You can brush in only one direction, which will pull stuff, lighter stuff down into darker stuff. But then this whole area that's right around her crotched area down in here, I can simply go through all of this and simply blend all of this out. Again, periodically pick up your brush so that it so that if you need to do an undo, it doesn't undo all the work that you actually just did. You can also, again, because I'm on the low layer here, if you feel like this edge right here is still a little too sharp, hit the L key to get the lasso tool. You can surround all of this. Again, I'm only working on my low layer, and you can blur this. So up to the filter menu, down to blur, down to Gaussian blur. And we'll see what it takes to hit this pretty hard. See what it looks like there. That's a little too hard. It seems a little bit better. And say OK, Command D to deselect. And you continue to go on like that. But that's basically where I would take this. Questions about this? All right, you can close this guy up. So now we're going to do some stuff that, we're going to do a quick set of runs here on some just quick things to catch up on. Nolan, can you start me a sign in? The first one is we are going to do the way, did I show you guys how to actually boost contrast other than using curves? Did we go over that? Anyone remember? It doesn't matter. Go to your session 10 files, and in the session 10 files you should find a Skin as Retouch version 3. If you could open that up and double click the hand. If we go ahead and take a look at this, it actually has been retouched. It's just a flattened version of the retouch. It's not a complete job. I haven't put in like hair or that kind of stuff. But what this is really lacking to me is a sense of contrast and a sense of shine, if you really want to know the truth. It seems relatively flat to me. So the way a lot of people would go after doing this to boost the contrast in this is you can add a curve to this. So come down to add an adjustment layer, and we're going to add a curve to this. And in the properties drop-down panel, you can see in the properties for your curve in presets, you can click on the presets and you can come down and say, I want to add medium contrast. And that's what it does. It puts on a simple S curve. Again, it makes your highlights a little bit lighter, your shadows a little bit darker. It also perverts the skin color. You see that her skin just got really orange. To prevent that from actually happening, change the blending mode of this curve from normal down to luminosity. And now this will actually put the contrast in without actually perverting the color. And so this would be one way of doing it. This is not my preferred method, but this is one way of doing it. I'm going to do a snapshot of this, and we're just going to call it curve contrast. And say OK to that. And then I'm going to turn that eyeball off, and I'm going to show you the way that I do contrast. And this is contrast for everything. I do this for still lifes, I do it for skin, I do it for landscapes, I do it for everything. It's, in my opinion, a much better way of actually doing contrast. So to do it, come back and select your background copy layer again. We're going to come over, and I'm simply going to load the luminosity of this image. Now, to load the luminosity of the image, just hover over the RGB channel, hold down the command key, and click, and you will get a bunch of marching ants. Now, again, it's loaded this based on the luminosity. To see what that really means, save this selection. Come up to the Select menu, down to Save Selection at the bottom, and just call it luminosity. And say OK. Hit Command D to deselect, and then scroll down to the bottom of your channels palette, and you'll see the saved selection. And if you click on it, this is what it looks like. And so the thing that I keep trying to impress upon you is that selections and masks, it's all the same technology. And when we made this, when we loaded this as a selection, the areas that are light and white are more selected than the midtones, which are more selected than the dark area of her eyes. When I loaded this selection, those dark pupils of her eyes were not selected at all because they are dark. Unlike the collar, which is far more selected than, say, the skin tone. To see what this really means, we are going to go back up to the very top to the RGB guide, click on the RGB guide to make it active again, and then we are going to load it again. So I want you to, again, hover over the thumbnail of the RGB channel, hold down the command key, and click to load it as a selection. Come back to your background image, and we are going to jump this to its own layer, Command J. And what we now have is, if you take a look at it, is only the highlights of this image were copied. Are you going to work on this, Nolan, or are you leaving, or what's going on?
No, I'm working on it.
Does this make sense what just happened? Again, I loaded the luminosity. The areas that are lighter are more selected than the areas that are darker. That's why this has selected all of her shirt, a little bit of her skin, none of her eyes, none of her eyebrows, none of the pupils, none of those things are selected here at all. A little bit of the background. This is the highlights of the image. Just by loading the luminosity, by definition, the lighter areas are more lit and the darker areas are less lit. Does this make sense, everyone, what's going on here? You're going to double click or just rename that layer and call it highlights. Turn the eyeball off. Go back down to your background layer, click on it, make it active again. Now we need to do the shadows. So to do that, come up over back to, again, the RGB channel that's the composite one at the very top. Hold down the command key, click again. We've just loaded the highlights a second time. These are the highlights again. I want the shadows. So go up to the select menu and come down and do inverse, the inverse selection. Now what is selected is going to be the shadows. And again, we're working on my background layer. Command J to jump the shadows to their own layer. Turn off the eyeball for background, and you can see now what has been selected. None of the shirt has been selected. A little bit of the skin has been selected. The pupils of her eyes are the most selected, and there you go. So these are now the shadows of the image. Did that work for everyone? Double click on the name and call it shadows. Now, we want to put these two in a group, because what I need to do is, there's a couple tricks still left to do here, but I want to be able to adjust the effect of the contrast in one slider. And so if I put them into a group, I can use the opacity slider of the group to increase or decrease the effect of both of the layers at the same time. So I'm simply going to hold down the Shift key to select both highlights and shadows. I'm going up to the menu, On the right hand side from the layers tab, click on the drop down and come up and say new group from layers, and I'm going to call it contrast and say OK. I'm going to open up the contrast group. I'm going to select, I've still got shadows as active, but I'm going to select, or visible, I'm going to select the layer, and I'm going to change the blending mode of shadows from normal to multiply. And then I'm going to go up to highlights, and I'm going to click on the highlights and change its blending mode from normal, got to turn the eyeball on, from normal to screen. And I'm going to turn on my background layer. And you can see now that, again, if you turn on the eyeball on and off for contrast for the group, that this puts in a significant amount of contrast. Now, the ratios that I'm going to give you right now are not written in law. This has to do with the image that you're starting with. So as a general rule, though, and this is very general, you want the highlight part of this contrast to be basically twice the intensity of the shadow part of this. So to get that ratio, simply click on your shadow layer that's in the contrast group and drop its opacity down to 50%. And if you do that, now what will end up happening is that the shadows are getting a 50% hit. The highlights are getting the full 100% hit, so it's sort of that ratio of 1 to 2. But you remember I said I wanted to be able to then control this with one slider. So if you simply click on the group itself and use the opacity of the group, you can drop this down to fine-tune your contrast. But we are going to do another snapshot of this guy. And I'm going to call this channel contrast. And say OK to that. And then go up to the top and let's just look at the difference. You should have a curve contrast and a channel contrast. Click on the curve and then click on the channel. And you tell me what's a better skin tone. You want to know how to put in those beautiful shiny highlights on beauty retouching? This is exactly how you do it. Not only that, we don't run the risk of blowing the any detail out because this is all based on pixel. This is not based on tone. Does this make sense to everyone what's going on? Again, you'll never do contrast any other way. Promise you. This will change everything. Are we good on this part? Okay. I want to actually sharpen this now for beauty, and one of the things that people run into all the time, the problems that I see, is you've gone to all of this work to smooth out the skin, and then you turn right around and you sharpen the shit out of it to print it out, and you end up with, you bring back all the texture that you were trying to suppress. So that's not a really good option for me. So I'm going to show you how I would go about doing it. I'm going to throw away the curve because I don't need the curve. I didn't like the way it did contrast anyway. The whole curve. I am going to do a merge stamp version of this because again I need to do my the sharpening on a complete layer. I can't do sharpening, I just need to do it on a complete layer, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to select the contrast group that's at the top. I'm going to hold down the Command key, the Option key, the Shift key, and hit the letter E. We've done this a million times. This does a merge stamp version of it. Now the contrast is baked into this image, which is what I want because I need to sharpen this entire image. I'm going to double click on the name and rename it Sharpening Layer, or just Sharpening. And we're now going to sharpen it. However, I don't want to sharpen the skin. That's the problem that I've got, and this is the thing that so many people do. So to avoid sharpening the skin, I'm going to come up to the Select menu, and I'm going to come down to Color Range. A dialog box will open up. In my case, Again, I like to see the a bigger preview. I'd like to see that my image is actually the preview as well, but I'm going to start by simply clicking on her skin tone. And you can see you get the small preview. It sort of shows you where we're going in this whole regard. However, I like to say, like I said, I like to see it on the big version of the file. So if you click on the selection preview drop-down menu and you change this from none to grayscale, you can see a bigger view of this right now. So that's what I'm going to do. I've got a fuzziness of around 40. I'm going to leave it there for right now. However, I need to add to this selection. If you simply click in another area using the eyedropper tool, like all selection tools, it gets rid of the original selection and gives you a new one. That's not what I want to do. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. I want to add to this selection. So to add to the selection, it's the little set of eyedroppers that are right underneath the OK channel, load and save. There's an eyedropper. The second one, the one in the middle, has got a little plus next to it. If you click on that little plus, then you can come over and say click on her cheek, and it actually adds that to the selection. If you click on the highlight that's right under her face, you pick up a lot of background, and I don't really want that part, so I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. I think the same thing is going to happen if I click on her chin. It's a little bit better, but I'm going to Command Z that guy as well. I'm going to try her neck finally, and that actually helped a little bit. You not only have to just select by clicking once, you can actually click and drag across it, and it will, anything that it hits over, it'll actually take care of. And this looks like a pretty good beginning of a skin mask for me. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK to this. Then you need to save this. Up to the select menu, down to save selection, and we're going to call it skin. And say OK. Command D to deselect. I am going to go to my tablet right now. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of my channels palette and click on the skin mask. This now actually needs to be refined. So I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush. I'm going to use a regular brush. I'm going to change the blending mode to about, we'll leave it around 75%. We'll see what that looks like. Normal blending mode, 100% opacity, 100% flow. White is my foreground color, and what you basically want to do, what you basically want to do is, I'm going to work in this area around, you want to leave her eyebrows, her eyes, her nostrils, her lips. You want to leave all of those are all going to go black. Everything else needs to go white. Her hair is also going to go black. So I'm going to start in a line that's very close to the top of her hair. Make my brush a little smaller, and I'm simply going to click and trace a line up along her hair to get rid of this part. These masks do not need to be anywhere near as perfect as the knockout masks that we actually use to do compositing work. This is a much more generalized mask, so you can actually come down and use overlay brush on this to get into areas where you want to sort of protect certain things. I'm going to go back to my normal brush though, because again, it doesn't need to be as perfect. You want to keep her eyelashes solid, and again, you want to keep her eyebrows solid. So again, I'm simply cleaning out those areas. And if there's something you can't get at, don't worry about it. Again, leave her nostrils in, but the rest of her nose goes white. Her lips stay black. The shadow under her chin is skin. It all goes white. And then the other parts that should be solid black need to be going black. So hit the X key and then go ahead and paint them in black. And then there's a little something on the background. You can go ahead and just take that all black. And then I'm going to do the entirety of her hair is also going to be black. That little patch of skin that's right between them that's showing, I'm going to leave that all white. And then finally, I'm going to overlay mask that little bit of skin that's right in the middle with white. And the rest of that. So this is now my skin mask. However, the problem that I have with this mask, oh, I missed a whole area at the very top. Hang on one second. Okay, and this. Okay, so now the issue I've got with this is that this is actually showing the skin and hiding everything else. I need the exact opposite, so Command-I to invert it. This will now mask out everything except for the skin will actually be hidden. Everything else will actually show. So I'm going to use it in just a second, but I'm going to go back now to my regular RGB image. I am going to change this sharpening to a smart object because, again, the sharpening that I'm going to do on it can function as a smart filter, so we can go back and adjust it later on. So I'm going to come up to the layer menu, down to smart object, and convert to smart object. It is now a smart object. And then I'm going to hit this pretty hard. I'm going to do it using unsharp mask. So up to the filter menu, down to sharpen, down to unsharp mask. And in this case, you can really smack this pretty hard. I'm going to zoom in and take a look at this. I'm going to crank the amount all the way up to 500%, and I'm going to change my radius up to 2. You'll see that it's a massive over amount of sharpening. But this way, we can really sort of see what's happening. And again, I can always go back in and readjust the sharpening because it's a smart filter. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. And you'll see that it actually over sharpens everything. I mean, it's anyway, that's what's going on in here. However, to show you what this mask will now do, come back down over to your channels palette, come down to the very bottom where your skin mask is. Do not select it. Simply hover over the thumbnail, hold down the Command key, and click. It will load it as a selection, and then you apply it as a regular layer mask on this sharpening layer. So I'm going to click on it to apply it, and you can see now what's happened is that the skin is all beautifully smooth like it originally was, but my eyes are actually over sharpened. So now we've got options here. You could double click on the unsharp mask, open it up to reduce it. The problem with that is that you never know if your sharpening is correct until you actually use it for what you were using it for. So if we were using this to sharpen an image for screen, I would know that this is too much. But if I was actually going to use this to sharpen for an output for a print, I will never know if it's correct until I make the print. The issue with sharpening for print is that pieces of paper are like sponges, and when inkjet shoots out and actually hits that piece of paper, you get what's called dot gain. The ink hits it, but instead of being a perfect little dot the way it was shot out, it bleeds, it spreads out into the adjacent area, which softens your image. So the reason you sharpen for prints is that if you over sharpen the print in your if you over sharpen the image on your computer, and then print it out, and the bleed, the dot gain, softens your image. If you've done it correctly, the over sharpening will counteract the bleed and the softening, and you will end up with an image that looks as sharp in print as it does on your screen. Again, you're never going to know. But in my case here, the simple thing about this is that all I need to do is use the opacity slider of this sharpening layer to give me every range that I need. I can go all the way from 0, which is no sharpening, up to like 50%, which like looks good to me for a screen output, website, that kind of stuff, all the way up to probably in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s for, not for glossy paper, but for a matte paper. This would probably be a good sharpening. Maybe it needs to go all the way up. But nonetheless, you're not fucking with the skin. You're only sharpening the things that truly needed to be sharpened. Does this make sense? You can close this up. You do not need to save this. So I'm going to show you two things right now that come from a book. There was a really important book written, it was a very important book for me anyway, about Photoshop, that was probably written in the 90s, maybe even the late 80s, early 90s. You can't get a copy of it anymore. But it was an extraordinary book in terms of how it understood Photoshop and what people could do with it. Part of it's a real lost art, and there's two books that have really, for me anyway, brought this sort of lost art back. So I'm going to show you guys how to do stuff right now that maybe 20 people in the world know, which is really hard to believe, but it's true. And it all has to do with recoloring fabric. So, to start with, we are going to go to our, it's still in that system class, the class session 10 folder. I need everybody to go into that folder, and you will see that there's a PDF in there of recoloring fabric. As a matter of fact, there's a beauty contrast boost in here. That's actually the contrast sharpening I just showed you guys. There's also sharpening for beauty. That's also in here. That's what we just went through. The next one I want to talk to you, though, about is recoloring fabric. So if you double click on this to open up this PDF, this is definitely a PDF you should be saving for the rest of your life, because I'm telling you right now, nobody knows how to do this. When I do this work, I don't bother to memorize this thing. I simply open up the PDF and follow the recipe. It's two recipes. One is starting with a black shirt, and the next one is actually starting with a white shirt. So we're going to go through both of these to actually show you and talk to you about the recoloring process. But I'm telling you right now, when I do this, like I say, I don't do recoloring that much, but when I do it, I go right back to this recipe, because you will not, I've never seen recoloring done that works this well. So that's where we're going to actually start. So to do this, you don't need to follow this just because I'm going to shout out the directions for you. What I need you to do is we are going to start there's a series of shirts in here. There's it's called a Shirt Dark version 2. If you can open up that Photoshop file, that's where we're going to start with. The reason I do this is that I've already built some selections for you. You'll see that if you look in the channels palette, there's the shirt is outlined, the labels are outlined, and the buttons are all outlined. So we've actually got something that we can sort of start to work with. So we're going to recolor this shirt. We are actually going to turn it into a white shirt. Anybody in this room have any idea how to do that? So I had a really smart aleck group once, and somebody said, oh, just invert it, do this. And I was like, okay, yeah, that sort of makes it a white shirt, but that's not really a believable white shirt for me, so I'm not going with that. So at any rate, this is how you do it. And again, I'm going to follow the recipe on this, so I'm just going to shout this out to you guys and explain what's going on along the way. The first thing that you have to do when you're doing recoloring work is you cannot stay in RGB. Remember, the problem that we have with RGB, it was exactly what we just saw when we were doing that contrast sharpening, when we put the curve on that girl. It built in the contrast, but it also made her skin, it changed the color of her skin. It made it much more saturated and more orange. So we need to avoid all of that when we're actually doing color correcting work. That's the exact opposite of what we need to do. So to do this, your first move is to change this to an LAB working space. So up to the image menu, down to mode, down to LAB. So again, look up at my screen to see where I'm at. When you do that, you'll notice that the RGB in the parentheses of the title of the image, it sits at the very top of the title of the image, at the very top of the screen, changes from RGB to LAB/8. That's telling us it's still an 8-bit image, but it is in LAB. And really quickly, just so that we're all on the same page here, sorry. Remember what happens in an LAB color space. Color is divorced from luminosity. Luminosity is the axis that goes from what we would consider to be the South Pole to the North Pole. Color exists in two axes. One is the A-axis, which is from green to red or green to magenta. The other is the B-axis that goes blue to yellow. So this is the color space that we're working for. We've divorced luminosity from color. To make sure that that has happened, or to see that, I want everybody to open up another image. Let's open up, we need something that's actually got color in it, and this image has no color in it. So do me a favor, go back to your session number 1 and open up the little red car. And again, we will convert that from RGB to LAB. So up to the image menu, down to mode, and actually select LAB color. I'm going to hide everybody else out, and then look over at your channels palette, and you will see that at the instead of having RGB like we normally had, you've now got 3 channels: lightness, A, and B. If you click on lightness, this is the luminosity of the image. It's just like a black and white image. It's the full luminosity information. If you click on the A, though, this is the description of the color that's actually in there. Remember, A is that red-green. So the reason the car has got so much lightness in it right now is because there's a lot of red in it. And then if you go to the B channel, again, this is the color information. But what's happened here is that we can impact the color without impacting the luminosity, and we can impact the luminosity without impacting the color. That's why we've converted this thing to LAB. So you can close that guy up. You do not need to save that. Back to the image that we're actually working with. But the conversion to LAB is critical, so just make sure that's on your list. First thing I'm going to do now to change the colors, I'm going to create a new group, an empty group. So I'm going to simply click on the new group right here, and I'm going to call this white shirt. And say OK to that. Then I need to put a layer mask on this white shirt, because what I want to do is I actually want to change the color of the shirt, but I don't want to change the color of the background, and I don't want to change the color of the labels. So I need to actually separate those out. If you take a look at your channels palette, you will see that I've already made one for you that's called, it's just called shirt. You do not select the channel, simply hover over the thumbnail, hold down the command key and click. You will load it as a selection and then come back over to your white shirt group and add it as a layer mask. And so now you can see the only areas that are white are the fabric. The buttons will be unaffected, the background will be unaffected, and the label will be unaffected as well. I'm now going to make a copy of the background layer. So I'm going to select the background layer and I'm going to simply hit Command J to jump it. And then I'm going to take that layer that I've made and I'm going to drag it on top of the group to put it inside of the group. And you can see in my layer stack now, it actually sets the copy of the background layer that's actually in the group is now sort of indented over to the right. That indicates that it's actually inside the group. My next move is to desaturate this. Now, most people would say, well, there's no color in here anyway. What I would argue, and this is true, because you can do this, you do not need to do this starting with a black shirt or a white shirt. You can do this with any color shirt. But your first move is to desaturate it because you want to remove all color. You don't want any color in this because we are going to add color. And it gets to be, to add a color to something that is completely neutral is much easier than it is to add color to something that already has color in it. Because then you're trying to really adjust the color, you're trying to modify a color that's already there, as opposed to from just starting from scratch. So that's how I'm going to do it. So to desaturate this, come up to the image menu again, down to adjustments, down to desaturate. Again, this is a destructive move, but that's okay. I've already still got my virgin copy is sitting back down underneath it, so I'm good to go as far as that part actually goes. And I'm going to double click on this and I'm going to rename it Desat1. Just so that I know it's desaturated and this is the first of them. So let me just check my layer part here. We need 2 more copies of Desat1. So Command J again. I'm going to double click on the one in the middle, and instead of calling it Desat1 copy, I'm going to call it Desat2. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the top. Instead of Desat copy, I'm going to call it Desat3. And say, okay, I'm going to turn off the eyeball for Desat3, and I'm going to turn off the eyeball for Desat2, and I'm going to select Desat1. Is everybody with me? Then I'm going to add a solid color layer on top of Desat1. So click on the adjustment layer, and then I'm going to come up to solid color. And the color that I'm going to actually type in, I'm going to click on the RGB values. Even though we're in an LAB image, you can still do it in RGB values. You can do it in LAB values, HSB values. It's just that all of the work that we've been doing, most people are understanding or have a better grip on using RGB colors. So I'm just going to use those values. I'm going to type in 245 for all the RGB values. So 245 for the R, tab key, 245 for the G, tab key, 245 for the blue key, and I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. And there's your white shirt. Looks great, doesn't it? That was a joke. Apparently not a very funny one. We need to change the blending mode of this solid color layer now from normal down to hard light. And you can see when I do that, it begins to start to put in. I'm beginning now to, I can see a little bit of the seam work in here. It looks more like a white shirt than just a really sort of like light gray shirt. But what I'm seriously lacking in here is contrast. So to build the contrast, select Desat2, turn it on, make it active, and change its blending mode from normal down to overlay. And you can see we're starting to now build in greater contrast. I'm starting to see the edges a little bit more. It still looks a little flat to me, so I'm going to go now to my Desat3, turn it on, make it active, and change its blending mode also from normal down to overlay. Again, we are building contrast in here. So when I look at this, this to me looks like, it looks like a sort of, well, on this screen here, it actually looks much better than it looks on mine. My issue is that it's more of a really very light gray shirt than it is a white shirt. So to fix that, go back to your solid color layer, double click on it, and change your values from 245 to 250. I wouldn't go above 250, but do it for all three channels. And say OK. Voila. So, collapse the group. We need to make a different color. A different color shirt. So I'm going to make a brand new, actually, let's just duplicate the group that we've got right here. So I'm simply going to, white shirt is actually selected. I'm just going to hit Command J to duplicate it. It duplicates everything that's inside of it. I'm going to turn off the white shirt so that it doesn't interfere with anything. And I'm going to open up the white group. And I'm going to then click on my solid color layer to open it up. So in photography, in fashion, in house painting, and anybody who's really going to describe color, deals with color, whatever, usually deals with Pantone colors. Who in this room has heard of Pantone? Everybody has, right? This may not be in this, I haven't checked yet. Photoshop has supported Pantone colors since its inception, but they have now had a falling out apparently with Pantone and don't want to pay them the licensing fees. And so there is a rumor that they are going to remove the Pantone libraries from Photoshop, and I'm going to find out right now. So if you come over, so with the color picker open like this, you will see that there is a button above the LAB readouts. It says Color Libraries. If you click on that, you will get a flyout, you will get another window that actually opens up, and then lo and behold, at least in this version of Photoshop, we still do have Pantone colors. At the very top where it says Book, there is a drop-down menu, and this part is critical for you guys to know that this can actually happen. So I'm gonna drag my Color Libraries window down to the bottom so that I can see everything that comes out of this. And what you'll notice that happens in here is that Pantone is not the only color system. If you look up at the very top, that full cold tone is actually a standard that's used in Europe. So different countries actually use different things. Pantone is pretty worldwide, but anyway. The thing that's important about Pantone colors is that the surface that they are put on is as important as the color. So what you see here, if you look at the top, you'll see where it says Pantone solid coated and then Pantone solid uncoated. These are two sets of ink. The ink will have exactly the same number, but the surface that it's actually put on is different, and therefore the color is different. So when somebody gives you a Pantone color, they will tell you whether it's coated, uncoated, whether it's metallic, whatever the grouping that it is in, that's the number that you'll actually get. Most of the time, the colors that we get for fashion are solid colored, so it's Pantone solid color. But you need to make sure that you know whether it's a coated number or uncoated, or whether it's a metallic coated or a pastel, because again, the numbers are exactly the same, but the colors are radically different. Does that make sense to everyone, what's going on? So I'm going to pick the solid color group. And then you will see that you actually have a Pantone library, and you can notice, you'll see at the very top, and you may not be where I am. We're going to all get to the same page in just a second, but I've got a Pantone 7541C. That C stands for coated. If you go to a different library, the uncoated, for instance, you will see instead of that C, there's a U. Now, these are the exact same numbers that I just had. Look at the difference in those two. No matter what color you're on right now, go back and forth between the solid and the other, and you will see a massive change, but the number is the same. So again, I can't stress enough to you how important it is you know whether your colors are coated or uncoated. Now I'm going to pick a color. I'm going to come up into the sort of reds and pinks. So let's actually make a pink shirt. I'm going to do 1767C. That's going to be the color that I'm going to pick. However, you guys have no really good, easy way to get there. So what you do is go ahead and select the Pantone Solid Coated drop-down menu, and then just very quickly type in 1767, and you will be right where I am. Did that work? Yeah, here, look, I'll show you. I'm going to jump into a color way down here and then type 1760. That's not good. All right, hang on one second. That usually indicates to me that my... Hang on one second. I'm going to stop the video because usually this indicates that the video is fucked.